Hi, my name's Angie, Angela Power Disney. I'm continuing with the reading of Tim Tate's book, Children for the Devil, Ritual Abuse and Satanic Crime, Satanic Abuse and Ritual Crime. Chapter 6. Chasing Shadows in the Dark. Since we've got ritual abuse cases on our files, we've got ritual murders there too. But we won't see that publicly. This subject is not for discussion. End of story. That's a quote from Senior Metropolitan Police Detective in June 1990. Wow, interesting to know who that was. On Wednesday, the 8th of August, 1990, a senior police child abuse expert stood up at an international conference on incest and roundly criticized therapists who claimed that children were being ritually abused in satanic ceremonies. Detective Inspector Sylvia Aston, a trained and trusted policy advisor to West Midlands Police on the issues of child abuse and rape, told her audience at Harrow, North London, "I don't know of any persons who have given any information whatsoever to the police which remotely substantiates some of the claims they make." Inspector Aston was particularly troubled by the repeated claims of survivors that they had been made pregnant within their cult, aborted and forced to eat the fetus during rituals. Quote, "A simple medical examination would at least indicate whether or not the women making these claims had in fact ever been pregnant and would provide the police with a starting point." The problem with the survivors' stories, according to Sylvia Aston, was that although this medical rarity, if ever, took place, social workers and volunteer counsellors were over-eager to accept the allegations unchallenged. This in turn could damage the credibility of social workers handling cases of non-satanic abuse. Quote, "Those who claim to help others will discredit their own aims if they are unprepared to back them with evidence. As a police officer, I keep an open mind. I believe satanic abuse occurs on rare occasions. We have had a handful of proven cases in the past decade." Consciously or not, Inspector Aston encapsulated in her short speech both the ignorance and confusion surrounding the policing of satanic child abuse and the all too frequent naked antagonism between the skeptical law enforcement community and those psychiatrists or therapists whose experience led them to believe in the reality of such ritual assaults. Wherever satanic abuse has been discovered or disclosed, the most frequent result has been a vicious polarization of the opposing sides. In turn, this polarization has caused mayhem, mischief, and misery. Ultimately, the losers have been those in need of help, the children. That these twin phenomena have taken place worldwide, from America to Holland and Great Britain, is an indication of their severity and intractability. It is also a cause for shame. This chapter aims to explain and cast light on the way in which detectives investigate ritual abuse cases and how social workers counsel the children. And light needs to be shed. Too often and for too long, individual police officers and therapists have been allowed to flounder blindly in the darkness of their own ignorance and egotism. In so doing, they have betrayed children who have suffered too much already. Had Inspector Aston undertaken even the most basic research before making her speech, she would have discovered the reasons for this betrayal, the recorded cases, whether prosecuted or not, of ritual abuse in Britain, Holland, Canada, and the United States have a great deal to teach us about the way in which such investigations are conducted, and more importantly, how they should be conducted in the future. We have already seen the most common reaction from detectives, lawyers, and judges in those cases successfully prosecuted in the United Kingdom: dismissal of the very idea that the abuser's apparent satanic motivation could be genuine. But what of the cases which never made it to trial, despite clear and convincing evidence of sexual abuse and remarkably clear description of the rituals in which it took place? What was it that prevented these cases from going to court? Children's Evidence, Great Britain. Janie, the South London mother we met in Chapter 2, reported the apparent abuse of her 2 children as soon as they disclosed it. She approached both her local social services department and the nearest police station within hours of the first allegation on the 6th of August 1988. 3 detectives came to her home the following day: an inspector and a sergeant, both male, and a woman constable. From the outset, the tone was helpful, according to a family friend who witnessed the visit. Quote, no one appeared interested in what Jamie had to say. The woman detective constable actually suggested that she was going over the top, saying, we mustn't get carried away with ourselves, must we? Given the appalling torrent of pain pouring out of Laura and Bobby, Janie was remarkably self-composed and level-headed. Her first priority was to stabilize the children, to make them feel safe. It proved to be no easy task. Both were able to identify many of their abusers. In addition to their father, the children gave Janie the names of a number of men and women who had systematically assaulted and tortured them. Very quickly, it became clear that many of them lived on the same estate, some in houses no more than 100 yards away. Still, Janie trusted the police and therapists. It is agreed by all the statutory agencies that in the course of her initial interviews with Lambeth Social Services Department, she held nothing back, explaining that 2 of her children said they had been severely abused over a long period by their father and a group of other men who performed bizarre rituals. She also warned the social workers that from what the children were saying, she thought Satanism was involved in the ceremonies. Faced with this frank account of what Janie's children were disclosing, Lambeth Social Services appeared to have fallen at the first hurdle. A cardinal rule of all sexual abuse cases is that medical examinations of the victims should take place as soon as the department is aware of the allegations. Physical evidence of penetration can disappear quickly, particularly if the abuse is anal rather than vaginal, and almost invariably if the victim is very young. Ironically, the younger the child, the greater the need for physical corroboration of their disclosures, at least if police are to stand a chance of successfully bringing charges against the offenders. It took Lambeth more than 3 weeks from Janie's first visit to arrange a medical examination of her children. That delay caused the paediatrician who conducted the tests to conclude that in Laura's case, the evidence was compatible with, but not conclusive of, sexual abuse. Fortunately, Bobby presented fewer problems. Here, the medical evidence was less equivocal. Quote, compatible with penile penetration of the anus. That word penile was to be very important. As soon as the results of the examination were known, Lambeth Social Services hosted a multidisciplinary case conference. The idea for such meetings is for therapists, doctors, and detectives concerned with a particular case to gather semi-formally and hammer out a unified strategy both for counselling care and for police investigation. After the organisational chaos of police and social worker relationships highlighted in the 1987 Cleveland inquiry, every child sexual abuse case in Britain was supposed to be handled through just such a multidisciplinary approach. Moreover, the report into Cleveland, published by Lord Justice Butler Schloss in the summer of 1988, stressed that the policy should almost invariably take a less dominant role than therapists in cases of child sexual abuse. Whatever the public interest in prosecuting offenders, children's needs for safety and counselling should come first. It was against this background that the cases of Laura and Bobby were added to the list of children on the books of Lambeth Social Services and the Metropolitan Police. Bobby and Laura's names were formally entered on the Council's official child protection register, and the police promised to investigate the ring of men who had allegedly abused them. In the meantime, both children were allowed to stay at home with Janie. Those inquiries should have been relatively easy to pursue, at least to the point of identifying the pool of alleged abusers, and more importantly, the other children involved. Both Bobby and Laura had been able to give clear descriptions of many of the adults involved in the abuse, and in some cases, Laura had told the detectives their full names. This has such resonance with the Hampstead case. Similarly with the children, both Janie's youngsters positively identified other preschool victims in their disclosures. One session with a volunteer therapist was typical. It began with Laura naming and describing the woman who, with her father, had led the group. Laura, Dee had sex with my brother. Therapist, how? Laura, demonstrated with dolls, miniature, mother, and baby doll. She wasn't satisfied until she got them in exactly the right position. This being Dee astride Bobby with her private parts directly over Bobby's private parts. Therapist, did she do this to anyone else? Laura, Daddy done it to me. No clothes on. Therapist, can you remember where you were when this was happening? Laura, at Dee's house. Dee and Daddy shouting at each other. Just Bobby, me, and Rebecca there. Rebecca's Dee's little girl. Dee's daddy eats people. What made the children's testimony remarkable, aside from the frequency with which Pamela Hudson's key indicators of ritual abuse peppered it spontaneously, was the number of children and adults they seemed desperate to identify. The child victims had become close friends with each other in truly bestial circumstance. The adults were clearly still objects of great terror for Laura and Bobby. Laura, quote, Laura recalled the volunteer therapist was adamant about catching the nasties, as she called them, and constantly asked if I was going to help. Because so many of the, quote, nasties appeared to live dangerously close to Janie, Lambeth Social Services agreed to support a housing transfer. But like the earlier arrangements for medical examination, the process was slow and cumbersome. Meanwhile, Bobby and Laura, having overcome their fear, were wanting to disclose to Janie almost constantly. Quote, I can't describe how I felt during those days and nights. Nobody could possibly understand what I went through with my kids, except mothers who've been in the same situation. It's actually impossible to put your feelings into words for other people to understand. In the beginning, I didn't think I would ever get through it. What Bobby and Laura were telling me was just so horrible. But I have days now that are, well, okay. Other times the days are just so as bad as they were. Some days I realize that this is my life now, and then I have other days when I just want to kill everyone." End of quote. On Monday, the 22nd of August 1988, the pressure finally told. Just before Janie left Laura and Bobby with their grown-up stepsister and walked from her home to the bus station in Norwood, South London. The bus took her to Waterloo, where she caught an aging British Rail commuter train to the small Surrey town of Brookwood. From there, a cab carried her to Her Majesty's Prison, Alma Dettington, near Deepcot. Inside the jail, her husband Dean was told that Janie had arrived. Dean was much younger than Janie, barely into his 20s when they were married. Janie had not known much about his family background other than vague and unsubstantiated rumours that some of the apparently endless flow of large denominations of banknotes Dean always seemed blessed with were the profits of organised crime. Janie never asked too many questions about the provenance of the smart leather furniture and high-tech electronic goods that graced their council house, nor did she question Dean closely about his frequent and sometimes lengthy absences. The culture of their respective families placed such delicate areas out of bounds. On the rare occasions on which Janie did press her husband for details of his private life within their short marriage, his answers were brief and characterized by an explosive violence. It was for one such attack inflicted on Janie when she was heavily pregnant that Dean had been incarcerated in HMP Alma Dettingham. When Dean was brought into the family interview room that sunny August afternoon, he found Janie sitting silent and tense at table 37. At first, they tried to make normal conversation. Very quickly, Janie could stomach it no more. Quote, "I knew I had to confront him. Until I did, I couldn't have been sure that I believed what the children had said about him and the abuse. So I asked him if he had any idea what he had done to Laura. He started looking panicky and couldn't speak. Then he started getting aggressive. He said she was making it up. After that, he was evasive, and his reactions just confirmed my suspicions. I knew then that it was all true. I took a knife out of my pocket and I stuck it in him. I said, 'How could you? Your own daughter, and she's only 3. I can't remember thinking anything else, just that the knife would wound him and that he'd be hurt.' Dean fell off his chair with 2 stab wounds in his abdomen and chest. Neither was deep, but Janie was promptly arrested and charged with attempted murder. As Detective Constable Alan Hardy read out the standard caution, Janie replied, 'I hope the bastard's dead for what he's done to Laura.' And here's a footnote by Craig McGowan. It isn't specified whether Dean is incarcerated in an open or closed prison system, and I'm unaware and could not readily locate standard operating procedure with guests of an open prison, so I do not know if it was even possible to bring in a knife. In any case, this part of the story did not sit well with me. I have visited people in prison, and I've done prison ministry, I'll just say, and certain prisons you can indeed sit at a table in a cafeteria kind of setting with the inmate. There are searches, but not always very thorough, so I would imagine it wasn't beyond the bounds of possibility. Continuing. The case against Janie was relatively uncomplicated. She admitted attacking Dean with a 4-inch vegetable knife she had brought from home, but she denied attempting to murder her husband. pleading extreme provocation as evidenced by her children's disclosures of abuse at the hands of their father and his friends. Surrey police bailed Janie with no financial surety attached and returned her to the family home and the support of Lambeth Social Services. Lambeth's proposed housing transfer was taking an age. Meanwhile, Laura and Bobby were constantly disclosing more and more details of ritual abuse in what appeared to be satanic ceremonies. Lambeth Social Services was clearly out of its depth, but then so was Janie. In desperation, she returned to a voluntary group which had campaigned for better treatment of child abuse victims, and which was also beginning to grasp the nettle of ritual abuse. The group was called Child Watch, and it was, ironically, probably one of the worst decisions Janie made that summer. We will examine the role of Child Watch more fully in Chapter 8, a role that has been pivotal in both the publicising of and subsequent backlash against satanic ritual abuse. But when Janie called its helpline in the Humberside part of Hull, she knew only that its founder and guiding light was an ex-social worker called Diane Corr. Now in her early 40s, Diane Corr had indeed been a trained and state-employed childcare worker. She had also been severely sexually abused as a child. The legacy of this abuse, compounded by her professional experience of the frequent inadequacies of social work departments in the field of child sexual abuse, led her to form her own charity, to campaign for better services, and provide occasional ad hoc counselling. She called the organisation Child Watch, based it initially in a spare room of her home, and set about seeking funds to keep it going. By the time that Janie called its helpline, Child Watch was well established in the north, with federated voluntary groups dotted across the map of England. Diane Corr herself had appeared on chat shows, documentaries, and in newspapers. She worked frequently and selflessly on behalf of the victims of all forms of child sexual abuse. Corr quickly arranged a private housing transfer for Janie and her children. By the end of 1988, the family had left their South London council house and moved into a large and solid terraced home in Hull. Janie, excuse me. Sorry, I got interrupted. I'll carry on. Right. Okay, so I'll go back to here. Corr quickly arranged a private housing transfer for Janie and her children. By the end of 1988, the family had left their South London council house and moved into a large and solid terraced home in Hull. Janie began to feel safe. She was away from the area in which many of her children's abusers lived. She had support and friendship from Diane Corr and her Child Watch workers. She was in a new town with a new set of social workers. What could possibly go wrong? Moving to Hull was, though Janie could not have known it, a very bad idea. By the end of 1988, Corr and Child Watch were in virtual open warfare with Humberside Police and Social Services. Department. Moving into the town with children confirmed as abuse victims, and at the same time being a Child Watch client, was tantamount to hanging a sign outside the door inviting social workers to scrutinise her every movement. The neighbourhood team manager of Humberside Social Services was Michael Palfreman. On Wednesday, the 30th of November, he called at Janie's new house to assess the family's circumstances. Inside, he found Laura, Bobby, and Janie's infant baby in the temporary care of their 19-year-old stepsister, Josephine. Janie had gone to the local shop. Josephine opened the door, and although suspicious at first, finally allowed the social worker inside to meet Laura and Bobby. Polframan seemed careful not to ask the children directly about the claims they had made to Janie. Instead, he appeared just to want a general talk with the youngsters, even though Bobby's garbled rush of words frequently seemed not to get through. There was one thing Bobby said that seemed to register, Josephine told her mother later. He said that he had been tied upside down and that someone had pushed a cross into his bottom. Then he looked straight at Mr. Pelfreman and said, "That's not very nice, is it?" Certainly the social worker was satisfied that both children were being adequately cared for. There has never been any friction between Janie and Humberside Social Services about her love and nurturing for the youngsters. The particular reason for Polframan's visit was a reconvened case conference, which was to be held in London the next day. Since it was to be attended by social workers from Lambeth and the investigating officers from the Metropolitan Police, Polframan wanted to know a little at first about the family that had landed on his patch. The conference was held at the Norwood office of Lambeth Social Services. Janie, as is all too common, was not invited to take part or be represented. To say the least, that was an unfortunate omission. Polframan's notes of the proceedings were never shown to Janie, but his summary of events were recorded in an affidavit nearly a month later. It was to be well into 1989 before Janie saw the allegations it contained. Quote, Laura had been through 3 separate disclosure sessions in September. I had to take her to King's College Hospital to a special room they used for these interviews. Some of the sessions were videotaped, and there was usually a policeman watching and listening behind a sort of 2-way mirror. I was allowed in with her twice. The third time, I had to sit behind the mirror with the police so that Laura couldn't see me. I think they did that because in the other sessions, Laura had been nervous with the social worker, and I had to help her explain, encourage her to disclose. The therapists told me that the interviews weren't conclusive, but that Laura had said enough on her own to make the police carry out some interviews. D.I. George told me later he did a whole load of those interviews. He even went to see Dean. But Dean just denied everything, said he loved the kids and never touched them, like we said. So the police said they couldn't take the case any further. But how did D.I. George and his men try? How seriously did they take Laura and Bobby's allegations? Within a matter of weeks, he told a case conference that he thought that Janie had fabricated the entire story and made a series of highly damaging, some entirely untrue, allegations about her own sexuality. He claimed that Janie's marriage was exceptionally violent, that she herself had attacked her lover in a lesbian relationship, that she had a lengthy criminal record, and that she was a suspected drug abuser and dealer. This catalogue of maternal misdeeds was apparently enough to damn Janie in the eyes of the case conference. Yet how accurate were the allegations made by D.I. George? Janie's criminal record was read out in January 1989 at a magistrate's court hearing where she was given a conditional discharge for the knife assault on Dean. It certainly showed that she had a small collection of petty theft and drug possession, all cannabis offences, and that she had served a few weeks in an open prison for one such charge. But it made no reference to any homosexual relationship, not in any event something to concern D.I. George's team of dedicated detectives, nor to any assault Janie had made on her alleged partner. The reason for this was simple. Janie had never had a homosexual relationship, much less attacked a lesbian lover. Similarly, D.I. George failed to draw the case conference's attention to the salient fact that although Janie's marriage was stormy and frequently violent, it was she who was on the receiving end and Dean who had been jailed for a vicious assault on her. The overall picture the policeman managed to convey, a dangerous, violent, homosexual drug dealer with a taste for bizarre fantasy about her children's sexual organs, was grotesquely and shamefully inaccurate. And what of the extensive inquiries, quote unquote, the police claimed to have made? Neither of the two young volunteer child workers who'd spent many days with the family were ever interviewed. Yet it was to these women that the children's initial disclosures were made. Disclosures that clearly and independently identified their abusers and the rituals during which the offences had taken place. There was, however, some supporting evidence for Janie's allegations. The medical reports from late August, which diagnosed abuse, and in Bobby's case at least pinned it down to penile penetration of the anus. In theory, this should have weighed in Janie's favour. She, after all, did not herself possess the necessary penis to penetrate her son's bottom. Instead, inspired apparently by D.I. George's sceptical view of her, Janie was officially listed as a suspect. The medical examination in August 1988, an examination Janie herself had asked for, had concluded that the children showed symptoms of sexual abuse. Yet the police had not identified the culprit. Janie had to be listed as a possible perpetrator or a collaborator with the actual abusers. Quote, I couldn't believe it when they first told me this. I was the one who had reported what the kids said. I had brought it to light in the first place. But Mr. Polferman said that didn't necessarily mean I hadn't done it. Again, I refer you to the Hampstead cover-up. The similarities are just textbook. Michael Polferman was correct in the latter observation at least. What he and all case conferences failed to take into account was the uncontested fact that neither Laura nor Bobby ever identified Janie as an abuser or as being present when the abuse happened. The two children were emphatic and quite clear on this point at least. But the damage had been done. Because D.I. George refused to believe the allegations of abuse, Janie was officially listed as a suspect. All three of Janie's youngsters were swiftly made wards of court on the application of Humberside Social Services. In itself, this was no bad thing. Wardship exists both to protect children and to preserve, by judicial ruling, their testimony. From the date of the wardship and police questioning of Laura and Bobby had to be sanctioned by a judge in the High Court. By January 1989, the emphasis had in any event switched from disclosure to therapy. Humberside Social Services were no longer concerned with who had abused the children, but rather, and quite properly, with helping them come to terms with the abuse. Unfortunately, Polferman and his colleagues knew next to nothing about ritual abuse and its lingering scars. Their sole admitted contact with ritual abuse casework had come through opposition to the efforts of Diane Core and Child Watch to help two other families in Hull whose children had apparently been the victims of abuse in satanic ceremonies. As we shall see in Chapter 8, Cor's work was far from satisfactory, though it was perhaps better than the absence of support Humberside Social Services had offered the families. As a result of the antagonistic circumstances surrounding those cases, and not least the enthusiastic press coverage that Cor managed to inspire, Humberside had adopted a policy of preventing what it called, quote, secondary abuse. This attitude was succinctly expressed in an affidavit from another social worker in one of the earlier cases. Jacqueline Ann Greensmith inherited the case from a colleague. She quickly discovered that it concerned Matthew, a teenage boy who, to the despair of his determinedly law-abiding parents, had become involved in glue sniffing and homosexual prostitution. Matthew, by his own account, had been renting out his services to a number of men since he was 7. Matthew's sporadic disclosures to social workers, Hull Police, Child Watch, and his parents were typical of their kind. He would give apparently precise details and identities of his abusers and the locations where it had taken place. Some of them, from the middle of 1987 onward, described what appeared to be occult ceremonies during which a number of young boys were first abused and then either tortured or killed. But at other times, Matthew would retract every last allegation, detail, and disclosure. As often as not, on these occasions, he would retreat into himself, refusing to answer even the most innocent questions. Had Hull Police or social services but known it, the pattern of Matthew's disclosures and retractions matched exactly that of ritual abuse victims all over the world. Greensmith was, however, far from impressed. Although accepting that Matthew had indeed been repeatedly and severely abused, she dismissed his evidence, despite the fact that one successful conviction had been based entirely on it. Matthew had first come to the notice of Humberside Social Services when he tried to molest his 6-year-old sister. During interviews with therapists, he finally described his own abuse. He had been repeatedly buggered by a group of adult men. Quite properly, the social services had referred those allegations to Hull Police. The result was the conviction of one of the abusers in July 1988. The success of that prosecution prompted Matthew to disclose more and more about the rings of abusers he claimed to know. But each disclosure, as is common with emerging victims of ritual abuse, contained minor inaccuracies which prevented the police from taking them further. Equally, the teenager was enjoying his newfound attention and took to what his mother described as giving me the runaround. Greensmith knew and resented the fact that Matthew and his mother had turned to Diane Cor and Child Watch in search of someone to understand or believe the boy's allegations of ritual crime. Both Cor and Matthew's mother had put him under a certain degree of pressure to name names and achieve more convictions. Matthew himself was less than confident about this idea. On a number of occasions, he agreed to tell detectives what he knew, only to change his mind at the last minute. Once again, this behavior was stereotypical of ritual abuse victims worldwide. Equally, the boy's actions indicated that there was a continuing sexually based problem. He repeatedly returned to his former life as a rent boy, prostituting himself for money, to buy ever stronger drugs. On at least one occasion, he suffered from what was later diagnosed as a psychologically derived bladder problem. His mind simply refused to let his body release the urine building up day after day. Finally, his parents could take it no longer and asked for him to be placed in temporary care. Matthew still, however, needed to disclose, even though the details were, for the purposes of self-protection, often deliberately inaccurate. He began running away from his care home, generally turning up on Diane Corr's doorstep and asking her to listen to his tortured memories. Greensmith described these sessions as secondary abuse and told his parents that he should be allowed to forget what had happened to him. Unsurprisingly, the boy's parents would not agree to preventing Matthew from talking when he wanted to. The solution, according to Greensmith, was to keep Matthew in a succession of ever more secure children's care homes, allowing parental access only under council supervision. Officially, the boy was, quote unquote, to be allowed to forget his traumatic childhood. To help him, Humberside Social Services had him made a ward of court and obtained wide-ranging injunctions preventing anyone, anywhere, from discussing his case. Even Matthew was to be silenced to prevent secondary abuse in the form of further disclosures. No, ever. Well, I'll read that sentence again. I'm sorry, this is making me so angry. So, officially, the boy was to be allowed to forget, quote unquote, his traumatic childhood. To help him, Humberside Social Services had him made a ward of court and obtained wide-ranging injunctions preventing anyone, anywhere, from discussing his case, ever. Matthew was to be silenced to prevent secondary abuse in the form of further disclosures. It was all for his own good. The problem was, Matthew could not agree. This should not have been surprising. Children who have been victims of ritual abuse, as opposed to, quote, ordinary sexual abuse, need far greater time and support in disclosing. At the time, as Matthew was beginning to detail his experiences of satanic abuse, Judith Dawson was managing Team 4's work with the multiple child victims in Nottingham. We will examine the Nottingham case in the next chapter, but in December 1988, Dawson had come to a clear conclusion. Quote, "You can't simply tell a child who's been ritually abused that he or she must stop disclosing now and go away and forget all about it. They can't. What they have seen, done, and had done to them is too extreme. They will probably need constant therapy for several years. And we need to understand that some of the things they say, particularly as they get older, will be misleading. I think it's a sort of self-protection mechanism because they've been forced by their own accounts to commit serious crimes themselves during the rituals." Humberside Social Services did not have access to Dawson's growing expertise. At that stage, she and Team 4 were beginning to encounter their own problems with a skeptical council management and a police force which had become nakedly hostile. Nonetheless, neither Greensmith nor Polframan appeared to have made any effort to research the problem of ritual abuse. The result was the attempt to silence its most vocal exponents, the child victims. In December 1988, Polframan sought wardship orders on all Janie's children, explaining that the process would protect the youngsters from secondary abuse at the hands of Child Watch and similar volunteer groups. He also told Janie that the orders would help the police to progress their inquiries. In fact, the police had abandoned the case for more than a month prior to Polferman's affidavit. The, quote, continuing process of assessment amounted to a few sporadic therapy sessions with psychiatrists who had no experience of ritual abuse. And the, quote, secondary abuse clause meant that, like Matthew's parents, Janie was henceforth injuncted against speaking to anyone about any aspect of her children's experience. The only tangible result of Humberside's actions was to allow Dean, now released from prison and contesting Janie's divorce petition, to go to court claiming the right either to custody of the children or at the very least unsupervised access. It was a battle still not concluded 2 years later. In the West Midlands, 200 miles from Hull, Julia was still holding her 2 children and listening with increasing nausea as their disclosures grew ever worse. By Christmas 1988, Timmy and Rachel had given sufficient details to tie the abuse into satanic rituals. But not merely were they either disbelieved or ignored by West Midlands police. After all, the limited and delayed medical tests had proved inconclusive. Walsall's Social Services Department was distinctly unhelpful. Day by day, as she worked patiently, if unscientifically, with her children, Julia wrote a diary. It catalogued both her attempts at therapy and her relationship with the statutory agencies. I'm just going to make an editorial note here. Sometimes it's not ineptitude or ignorance on the part of police and social services and even organisations like Childline or Childwatch. Sometimes they are part of the rings. They are part of the rings and they are put in places of authority and decision-making around children exactly to prevent the disclosures going anywhere and to attempt to take captive the children and end up giving custody or unsupervised access to the alleged abusing father, which has happened in the Hampstead case. End of editorial note. Quote, December 88, January 89. Talk more openly with Timmy and Rachel about their abuse. After a few weeks, they're chatting quite freely. I tape each conversation so that our social worker can follow progress. January 9th. I asked Timmy if Daddy ever put his willy up Tim's bum. The reply is astounding. A flow of descriptions, so visual, comes through that I am flabbergasted. He says, oh yes, when he broke through the wall in my bum and his wee exploded inside, he had to put his finger up and get his willy out quick. I rang our social worker the next day and told him I'd got some of this on tape, and of course asked him what I was to do about the disclosure of buggery. He said he'd tell the police, but they still had no legal grounds for prosecuting. January the 11th. I have been told by police and the senior social worker that I may have to accept that my husband will get access in the custody hearing. The senior social worker said the theory was that access to an abusive father gave a child the chance to see he's not a monster. My response is that he is a monster. January the 23rd. The senior social worker told me to do no more, quote, holding work, brackets. Julia had been using the holding technique pioneered for use with autistic children. She was told to do no more holding work with Timmy as the pressure was continuing the abuse. I have found the reverse. In fact, It lifts each layer so that by putting his fears into words, it releases the fear little by little. The senior social worker says that as he has already described the abuse, there's no need to go into detail. I was told to stop holding him, and the report she is putting into the court is very powerful, so I need to keep quiet. I was also told that I was not capable of working with Timmy. This is still reading from the diary of the mother. Quote, not the best person, and that she was taking our own social worker off the case as a family, and instead he'd see Timmy an hour a week. Not on disclosure work, but to get to know him, as Tim had no male company. I was surprised a little at her hostility, but then again, not after the experience of the last 8 months. I am rather annoyed at the possibility of losing our contact with a good social worker. I am also worried about the break in continuity, since our worker knows most details firsthand from police, solicitors, childminder, tapes, children, witnesses, etc. January 25th, told our social worker about the senior social worker's recommendations. He's rather surprised at being taken off the case. I tell him I feel humiliated by their inferences and surprised by some of their theories. I don't know what they expect to hear anymore. I also begin to wonder who is experienced in this sort of sex abuse. Our social worker says he wasn't sure he was the best person to work with Tim, as he had already applied for help from an organisation called Sexual Abuse Child Consultancy Service. Their experience is the only expertise available in the area. Just going to pause here. Sorry, I'm going to have to move my office out to the cabin in the garden because I keep getting interrupted. You'll forgive me. Right. The agency which Julia's social worker had asked to help is more usually known by its acronym SACCS, or SACS. It was founded in 1984 by two respected therapists, Madge Bray and Mary Walsh, both of whom were frustrated by the bureaucratic restrictions which hindered their work with abused children. Bray and Walsh set up SACS to work full-time and on a consultancy basis with abuse victims referred to them by a variety of local authorities. By 1987, Madge Bray had become respected not only by the children with whom she worked, not only by the social service departments who bowed to her greater experience and flexibility, but also by the Home Office, one of two government departments. The other is the Department of Health, with responsibility for public policy on the issue of child sexual abuse. When the government announced that year the establishment of a judicial committee of inquiry into the Cleveland child sexual abuse controversy, it appointed a number of specialist advisors to assist Dame Elizabeth Butler Sloss, the senior judge who was to preside over its hearings. One of these advisors was Madge Bray. We're in the middle of a lockdown, so everybody's in the one house. I apologise for the interruptions. Right, continuing. Butler Sloss, can you believe it? I'll start at the top again. When the government announced that year the establishment of a judicial committee of inquiry into the Cleveland child sexual abuse controversy, it appointed a number of specialist advisors to assist Dame Elizabeth Butler Sloss, the senior judge who was to preside over its hearings. She was the judge of the current independent inquiry into child sexual abuse in the UK. She had to step down because of her close relationship with Sir Leon Britton, Home Secretary and Member of Parliament, alleged abuser with multiple survivors, including ones I know personally, disclosing sexual abuse allegations against him. He also claimed to have lost a dossier given to him by another MP with multiple details and evidence of child sexual abuse. He said he lost it. He's allegedly dead now. So Dame Butler Sloss had to step down as the presiding judge over this current inquiry, as being too close to alleged abusers, having dinner with and being neighbours with Sir Leon Britton and his wife. One of these advisors was Madge Bray. The appointment, however, was a double-edged compliment. Although widely praised for its subsequent report, the Butler-Sloss inquiry team was very much in the public eye. For specialists like Madge Bray, working in the eye of the Cleveland storm, that required a speedy development of political skills. One casualty was the acknowledgement, in public at least, that satanic ritual abuse was a reality. One Saks worker summed up the problem, quote, "We know it exists on a far bigger scale than anyone has been prepared to admit. We know it because we see some of the victims, but we can't go public on it. Just look at the outcry over Cleveland. People weren't ready to accept that such severe and extensive abuse existed. Now ask yourself whether I, as an independent therapist dependent on social services department for contracts, can go out and announce that ritual abuse is very real and very much with us. I'd be crucified, and that wouldn't help the children I counsel every day." In the event, Julia's children never got to see a therapist from Saks. The West Midlands Social Services Department decided that it was not worth the money, given the lack of conclusive medical examination. Julia was effectively on her own. February 2nd, from her diary again. Rang the health authority child welfare worker to tell her we've been refused help from Saks. She told me that the council was setting up an expertise base, but that it would take time. I asked her how long. She didn't know. I told her we'd had no proper disclosure help or therapy since I'd last seen her in the summer. She then offered to get my health visitor to organise for the school psychologist to come and see the children. I told her we had no health visitor. She seemed to know the extent of the sexual abuse on the children. She had no idea it was as bad as I'd discovered. No, she wanted to know the extent of the sexual abuse on the children. She had no idea it was as bad as I'd discovered. At the time of the case conference she had attended, we knew nothing about Timmy's abuse. I told her it extended as far as probable buggery with Timmy, torture, blankets over Rachel's head, knives at her throat, abuse in the cellar, hurting them all over their bodies, ejaculating into every orifice, punching, kicking, etc., etc. All this had been related by Timmy and Rachel. At the bottom of this page in her diary, Julia wrote a small, heartfelt plea, even though she'd had no idea who might ever read it or when it might be seen. Quote, "Please help to change this system that allows perverted evil on innocent little children to be promoted and prolonged by non-action, and a diseased law to protect the perpetrators and expose children to the danger of losing their lives or worse." End quote. By the end of February, Julia was almost at the end of her tether. Timmy and Rachel were disclosing ever more horrific details of what were quite clearly ceremonies in which a number of children were apparently abused, tortured, killed, or mutilated. West Midlands Police, however, refused to take any action on the children's disclosures, saying they were hearsay when Julia reported them, or the results of leading questions when she presented the detectives with the tape recordings. The Social Services Department was distinctly unhelpful, repeatedly warning Julia against continuing her work with Timmy and Rachel. The local NSPCC declined to become involved. Julia felt increasingly pushed into the arms of the church. Although raised as a Christian, she had a deep distrust of the clergy, the more so since Timmy appeared to believe that some of his abusers were priests. Nonetheless, she was persuaded that spring to allow a service of exorcism on Timmy and their house. Quote, 30th of March, begin using prayers I've been given by the bishop's exorcist to work with Timmy. The exorcist says the devil has been passed into Tim by his father, and we begin asking the Holy Spirit to flood him with light to send the evil back to its source. 31st of March to the 7th of April. Continue working all week. Every day Timmy feels the improvement and says the other children need us to help them understand. They believe the devil's got their soul forever, but it's not true. Jesus has Timmy's now, and he wants us to go and save them. The hard work is all worthwhile. It feels like a miracle. This is the author speaking. Julia had fallen into a common trap for parents of children abused in satanic rituals, blind embracing of the rival, and no less strict religious doctrine of Christianity. The Christian response to ritual abuse cases will be examined in detail in Chapter 8, and with it the organisation that Julia finally contacted, Reach Out. In spring 1989, the Reach Out Trust was run from a small semi-detached house in Rhyl, North Wales, by a committed Christian, Maureen Davies. The trust itself was a branch of the multi-denominational Evangelical Alliance, an umbrella organisation made up from moderate and fundamentalist Christian churches, all dedicated to preaching the Christian gospel of salvation. Reach Out described itself as the Christina ministry to those in the cults and occult. Its view, as we shall see later, was that any form of pagan or occult activity was automatically spiritually dangerous. Maureen Davies put forward this belief with a genuine and exhausting concern. From 1989 onwards, she was to work herself into severe illness. Julia was referred to Reach Out by a friend who had heard Maureen Davies speak on television. Initially, the contact seemed wholly beneficial. Davies listened carefully, made notes, and managed to put the bizarre series of disclosures into some kind of satanic context. The problems developed later. From early summer onward, the Social Services Department became increasingly unhappy about the level of therapy work Julia was attempting with her children. When the council acted, it first made the children wards of court. As in Humberside, the idea was to protect the children from secondary abuse and from exploitation by overzealous voluntary groups. The introduction of Reach Out did nothing to calm the council's fears. As autumn turned to winter and then 1989 turned into 1990, the social services moved to take Timmy and Rachel into care. The reason was a genuine fear of secondary abuse. That Julia's constant pouring in of the light, quote unquote, could have a detrimental effect on the children's welfare. But the spur was the knowledge that Reach Out had circulated confidential details of the case, clearly identifying children who were, after all, wards of court. At the same time, Julia's ex-husband was suing for custody or for unrestricted access. Julia was torn in two. The custody hearings required her to deliver up all the tapes she had made with the children. Yet these clearly identified her ex-husband and other adults whom Timmy and Rachel said had been abusers in the rituals. To hand over the tapes would be to place the children in potential danger. But Reach Out had already distributed copies, and Julia knew that if she refused, she risked being held in contempt of court. If that happened, she stood little or no chance of regaining custody of her children. Quote, I have to say I wish I'd never got in touch with Reach Out. Their actions, though for the best and most genuine of reasons, have placed me and my children in a terrible position. But I don't blame Maureen Davies. She was really the only person, Reach Out, the only organisation I could turn to who knew anything about it. If the social services, the police, or the NSPCC had been able to help, I would not have been in this position. As it is, my kids are in care, they don't get proper therapy, and the possibility is that I won't see them ever again. Where is the justice in that? A year later, as this chapter was written, Julia was still fighting her custody battles with her ex-husband and the local authority. In all the courtroom drama, the miserable experiences of two very young children abused in rituals appeared to have been forgotten. On Wednesday, the 5th of April, 1989, Natalie woke early. She washed and dressed quickly before waking her mother. Kitty lit the first cigarette of the day and began preparing herself for the coming ordeal. At 8:30 that morning, mother and daughter left the Hampstead house in which they'd stayed the night and travelled across London by tube. They got off at Blackfriars and walked up Ludgate Hill before turning into the confusion of modern and historic buildings that house the Central Criminal Court, better known as the Old Bailey. The journey to Bailey had been far longer than the physical trip across town. To get this far had taken an immense amount of courage both for Natalie and for Kitty. In little more than a year, Natalie's tearful disclosures of her own abuse and the cannibalistic satanic rituals she'd been forced to attend had turned Kitty's world inside out. During the years when Natalie had stayed with her nan, Kitty had carved out a new life for herself. She had remarried and borne two sons. One was slightly backward, requiring the constant care and attention of his mother. The family lived in cheerful chaos on a small estate in a Sussex village. Kitty devoted herself to caring for her husband and her children, conscious always that she had failed in her maternal duty to Natalie, but never suspecting the obscene ordeal her eldest child was being put through. When that January in 1988, Natalie walked back into her mother's life and pleaded not to be sent, quote, home to her nan, Kitty's normal family life disintegrated. Quote, I used to throw up a lot when she plucked up the courage to tell me what had gone on. A sort of horror came over me, quite inexplicable horror, and fear too. Fear for her mind, for having been present at such ceremonies. And then the anger took over, that someone could consider taking my child and doing this. It shattered everything I had. My marriage is dead, over now, and I'm changed too. I used to know how I would react in any given circumstances. Now I couldn't be sure. I've become very vague, very absent-minded. I don't sleep at all well. Behind it all, I think, is the stress of this case. It's changed everything. I mean, if it was a matter of rape, although that would have been terrible enough, I think I could have coped. But it seems as though Natalie was totally encased in evil, and she knew no other world. And I will never, never forgive myself for leaving her there. With Kitty's help, Natalie found the courage to talk to the Metropolitan Police about her abuse. It was an intensely painful experience, made the more difficult because she knew she had been made to take part in some of the serious crimes she described. Natalie had not merely been raped and assaulted herself, hadn't just witnessed the abuse and torture of other children. Her abusers had made her harm, even kill, other young children or babies. In her own mind, Natalie felt as guilty as the men and women who controlled her. Kitty, too, had an extra burden to bear. The men and women Natalie identified were her relatives by her first marriage. Knowing that the perpetrators of such horror made it doubly difficult. Gradually, both Natalie and Kitty came to terms with the need to talk to detectives. They were handled with kid gloves by investigating officers who believed much, if not all, of what the teenager said in her statements. To their credit, they did not doubt the rituals, nor even the murders or the illegal abortions, though they had reservations about the number of times Natalie believed she'd been made pregnant. Above all, the team of detectives realized that what mattered in the early days was suspending their own disbelief long enough for Natalie to begin to trust them. By the middle of 1988, the bond was there. It was still desperately difficult for Natalie to go over her statements again and again, but she knew what the policeman believed her. She knew that the policeman believed her. In part, this belief had been strengthened by medical tests she'd undergone. These showed that Natalie had certainly been sexually abused, and that she had been aborted, on one occasion at least. Simultaneously, the police arranged for a, quote, blind test to be conducted. Natalie was shown, without warning, a large collection of medical implements and asked if she recognized any of them. She picked out, to the exclusion of all others, those used in abortions. Although the team of detectives had some doubts over Natalie's claim to have undergone 8 such terminations, the medical test suggested this was highly unlikely to be accurate. They felt that there was enough evidence to charge her alleged abusers. This was partly due to the fact that Natalie was now 15, and her testimony in court would not attract habitual judicial warnings to the jury about the potential weakness of children's evidence. But the detectives also knew that some of Natalie's key disclosures had been corroborated quite independently and in secret by a much younger child. Judicial warnings or no, the police privately decided that they would call the child to give evidence if the going got rough. Unfortunately for Natalie, at least, policemen no longer make decisions about the shape and content of the prosecution cases they build. The 1984 Police and Criminal Evidence Act passed the responsibility to the Crown Prosecution Service. Lawyers with no investigative experience whatsoever, much less knowledge of the problems of ritual abuse. The CPS decided at first that there was enough evidence to sanction charges of rape against 7 named male defendants, together with specimen charges of aiding and abetting rape and procuring an illegal abortion against Natalie's nan. The 8 were duly arrested, charged, and released on bail. But the lawyers insisted that Natalie censor her evidence. There was to be no mention of any rituals, murder, or cannibalism, much less the worship of Lucifer or Satan. They seemed to want an expurgated version of what Natalie had told me. They had no way of coping with all the detail. They were very frightened that all the ritual stuff, all the evidence of Satanism, would prejudice the jury. And yet throughout all the hearings, Natalie was made to go into the witness box and swear an oath to tell the truth. All the time the lawyers stressed how important it was that she understood what truth is. Fair enough, they have to be sure of that. But then she was not allowed to tell the truth. While the Crown prosecution lawyers prepared the case for trial, Natalie and Kitty were largely left to support and counsel each other. Early on, their local social services department had booked the teenager into a group therapy session with other victims of sexual abuse. But Natalie's abuse wasn't simply sexual, and very quickly the group rejected her. Quote, as soon as Natalie began to talk in the therapy sessions about what had happened to her, and it took a lot of courage, even though she needed to say it desperately, she was told to be quiet, to shut up, because she was upsetting the other kids there. The group was useless for her. It was designed to help children who'd been abused by some member of their family, not kids who had been through the rituals Natalie had. But all the time she was still needing to give off, to talk about her experiences. She told me at one point that she was frightened to give too many details in case it affected my health. She didn't want to see me suffer, and I suppose I'm just about all she's got left. She really wanted to protect me from it all. Eventually, Natalie was assigned a counselling teacher, a woman at the local school she now attended, who had been told about the ritual abuse, the murders, the abortions, and the cannibalism. The teacher became a key person in Natalie's slow development. It was very quickly apparent that she had missed much crucial schooling in the years she lived with her nan. Her teacher knew the reasons, made allowances, and helped with the traumatic flashbacks whenever they occurred. As part of the constant therapy, the teacher encouraged Natalie to write down her experiences in a cheap notebook. Whenever the teenager became visibly stressed by her memories, she would be assigned a sort of essay with titles designed to exorcise the past by writing it down. The notebook began to fill up quite quickly. Kitty, too, had found someone to talk to. Aside from her two sisters, she had felt utterly isolated from normal life, particularly after her marriage disintegrated under the stress. Only the constant mutual support between the women kept Kitty going. Natalie, and she frequently travelled up to the big house in Hampstead, where her older sister lived. One morning in January 1989, however, Diane Corr arrived, unannounced, on the doorstep. Corr worked closely with the Conservative MP, Geoffrey Dickens, in campaigning for wider recognition of the problems of child sexual abuse. Kitty had had some contact with Dickens, who in turn referred to her to Corr. It proved, at least at first, to be the boost Kitty needed. Diane Corr's record on the issue of ritual abuse is, as we shall see in Chapter 8, distinctly checkered, but she's a naturally warm, caring and supporting therapist. She gave Kitty and Natalie at that crucial point the unconditional love and uncritical acceptance both so desperately needed. Corr was also, for the moment, scrupulously careful not to do or say anything which might contaminate Natalie's evidence. So although Kitty constantly asked for background information on Satanism and ritual abuse, Child Watch had publicly announced its interest in the subject, Corr gently but firmly refused the requests. To have passed on such information would have opened up the possibility of prejudicing the forthcoming trial. Throughout the winter and early spring of 1989, Kitty tried to prepare Natalie for the ordeal of cross-examination in the witness box. Natalie frequently wanted to duck out of the trial, knowing that the defense was bound to attack her credibility as a witness, and worried by having to remember which parts of her story the CPS lawyers said she was allowed to relate. At these times, Kitty said nothing to try and persuade her daughter The decision to proceed was hers and hers alone. Natalie came to terms with the prospect of hostile questioning several weeks before the date fixed for the trial. "I'm going to tell the truth," she said. "It's important not just for me, but for the other kids who were abused there, and for those that I left behind." The memory of the children still in the house when she ran away was a potent one. Natalie was utterly convinced that she had left behind her own child, the product of a ritualized rape, and shown to her alive and lying in a type of incubator. Whether the child was actually hers or a cruel and mind-bending hoax aimed at destroying her will, Natalie bore an almost unbearable grief. She had named the child Alex. When pressed, she said the forthcoming trial was for Alex, not her. Just a footnote here, this girl has since gone public, or back then, there is video of her telling her testimony and talking about the child, Alex. I'll share a link in the description box. Only days before Wednesday, the 5th of April, however, Natalie's counselling teacher unknowingly derailed the proceedings. She knew, of course, about the trial and had become concerned that she should hand to the police the notebook containing Natalie's therapeutic essays. The moment she did, the prosecution was effectively finished. The CPS lawyers had been careful to include in evidence only that testimony referring to sexual abuse. There was no mention of murders, cannibalism, or drugs. Yet Natalie's notebook contained detailed recollections of the ceremonies in which they took place. Under the rules of evidence, the prosecution would have to disclose the notebook to the defense. But if it did, the defense lawyers would have a wealth of ammunition to cast doubt on the credibility of the Crown's chief witness. After all, if these serious and substantive allegations had been made, why were they not included in the evidence? Early that Wednesday morning, the lawyers met the detectives. They told them a decision had been made to offer no evidence, and thus to drop all charges when the case was called into court. My God. Totally and utterly betrayed by her legal team. They refused point blank the police report to call the young child, whose statement corroborated some of Natalie's allegations. The case was over. The lawyers told Kitty and Natalie just before making the announcement in open court. Mother and daughter walked out of the Old Bailey, took a tube to the main line station, and then a train home to Sussex. Later that afternoon, Kitty took an overdose of sleeping pills. By luck, though she did not see it that way, Kitty was found in time, her stomach pumped, and 2 days later, delivered back home to her broken marriage, bewildered young sons, and a silent and resentful Natalie. That mother and daughter eventually repaired the damage and became again firm friends. In a testament to the relationship forged a year earlier in the pain of early disclosures. By late summer 1989, Natalie had settled back at school and gave every appearance of having put the ordeal behind her. Only her new therapist, a psychiatrist with experience of ritual abuse, saw the trauma and open scars hidden behind the veneer. Quote, "We meet once a week, and if she wants to talk about it, I let her. There's no pressure, and sometimes she tells me she just wants to forget. To be honest, I don't think she ever will. I expect I'll still be seeing her, that she will still need some sort of therapeutic support several years from now." The fiasco of the trial didn't help her one bit. It raised her expectations and then dashed them. But protection or not, prosecution or not, I'm certain of one thing. Natalie is telling the truth. She may not have been through as many abortions as she thinks. Some of them may have been tricks dreamt up by her abusers to brainwash her. But even that probable error she didn't invent. She truly believed what she was disclosing, and that's the first battle for a therapist, to help the victim through what they think they have experienced. But on top of that, I'm quite clear that her story was not fantasy. The pain in her disclosures was too real, the detail too great and too consistent. And what's more, the details she told me that were never published match the details other survivors have given me. And those weren't made public either. Kitty too had found a way of coping that summer. She got angry. She began quietly and carefully, in order to protect her daughter's identity, to speak out on behalf of ritual abuse victims. She asked Geoffrey Dickens to take up her case in Parliament. That he did so was a tribute to his persistence and to Kitty's faith in public opinion. Dickens had previously raised the problem of ritual abuse in the House of Commons late in 1988. The focus of his attack was unclear, and he managed, like many amateur campaigners, to incense law-abiding pagans by lumping all occult religions into one evil satanic conspiracy. Nonetheless, his heart was in the campaign, and he shrugged off the ridicule and sniggering that greeted his speech in the chamber of the House of Commons. Not so Kitty. She was furious at the apparently callous indifference of Parliament. Quote, when Geoffrey Dickens stood up and said that Satanism and satanic ritual abuse was going on in this country, he was laughed out of the House of Commons. I would like those MPs who jeered to come and walk 1 mile in my shoes, 1 mile in Natalie's shoes, and then tell me what a big joke it is. How wonderfully funny the subject can be. Dickens, for all his unscientific approach, pressed the Home Office for an explanation of the collapse of Natalie's case. Home Office Minister John Patten tried to shrug off the problem by passing the buck. Quote, as you know, child abuse is a matter of great concern to the government, and we've done all we can to improve arrangements for the investigation of child abuse and the prosecution of offenders. The Criminal Justice Act, for example, included provisions abolishing the requirement for children's unsworn evidence to be corroborated. Acts of witchcraft and the occult, which involve cruelty to children, grievous bodily harm or assault, or rape, would all constitute criminal offences for which the courts may impose heavy penalties. Although I do understand and sympathise with Natalie's ordeal, you will understand that as a minister, I cannot comment on a decision not to prosecute in a particular case. This is entirely a matter for the Crown Prosecution Service. Undeterred, Dickens then wrote to the Attorney General, the government law officer nominally responsible for the Crown Prosecution Service. On the 3rd of August 1989, he received a reply from an official within the department. Quote, I have had the opportunity of considering a very full and detailed report on this case prepared by the Crown Prosecution Service. The case was always a difficult one from an evidential point of view. The only evidence relating to the relevant events was that of Natalie. There was no evidence which corroborated her account. This opening was far from impressive. It appeared that the CPS had entirely forgotten to draw the Attorney General's attention to the existence of a supportive child witness and to the medical evidence which would have backed some of Natalie's allegations. Worse was to follow. The letter entirely misrepresented the dates of the proposed trial, together with both the timescale and the source of the conflicting evidence which led to its cancellation. Instead, it suggested that, quote, Natalie's credibility was so damaged by this new evidence that the CPS concluded it would not be proper for the prosecution to seek to rely on her evidence. Nowhere in the letter is there any recognition that the cause of the damaging evidence emerging at a late stage was the Crown Prosecution Service's refusal to allow Natalie to tell the whole truth about her ordeal, to trust a jury with the information that satanic abuse existed and devastated children's lives in Britain. And again, editorial note, I refer you to a DVD I made in about 2010 called Chasing Rainbows by Angela Power Disney on Vimeo, in which this exact thing is spoken about in my niece's court case, where you take an oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, but your legal team advises you, no, you can't go outside of statement to the police. You can't add to it, which was a lie. And I would also suggest that the motivation for a lot of these legal teams and government bodies sabotaging cases is not just ineptitude or ignorance, but being complicit. Just 5 days after the Attorney General's Department placed that letter in the House of Commons Internal Postal Service, Inspector Sylvia Aston of the West Midlands Police made her attack on those therapists who supported claims of ritual abuse, satanic ceremonies, and cannibalism. One passage of her speech, that suggesting a, quote, simple medical examination to prove the allegations of enforced pregnancies and abortions, had a hollow ring for all those involved in Natalie's case. The reality was that in some cases at least, medical tests had indeed been undertaken, tests which gave support to the survivors' claims. It was law enforcement and the judicial system which failed the victims of ritual abuse, not the dedicated therapists who were left to pick up the pieces of shattered lives. Policing Satanism, Great Britain. We should not perhaps be unduly hard on Inspector Aston. Satanism is, quite rightly, not in itself a crime in Great Britain, though satanic groups do not enjoy the constitutional protection and tax-exempt status of the American counterparts. Inevitably, that has led the law enforcement community to regard such groups as off-limits for any intelligence gathering or activity monitoring. Were Satanism a conventional religion, this respect for its adherents' civil liberties might be admirable. But as we have seen in previous chapters, the history of satanic worship is inextricably bound up with the commission of serious criminal offences, offences which too often require children as their victims. Conventional law enforcement wisdom in the United States as well as in Britain puts forward a double-barreled justification of its stubborn refusal to study the history and instance of satanic crime. The, quote, expert most usually cited in this context is Ken Lanning of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. Quote, the law enforcement effort must focus on crime and clearly recognize that just because an activity is satanic does not necessarily mean it is a crime. Bizarre crime and evil can occur without organized satanic activity. The law enforcement perspective requires that we distinguish between what we know and what we're not sure of. Lanning's cautious approach might at first seem sensible, particularly in light of the muscular campaign by organized Christian groups to hijack ritual crime seminars and divert detection along purely religious lines. Put simply, the Lanning line amounts to the following reassurance: crime is crime, the motivation doesn't matter. Furthermore, he suggests that whatever the religious affiliation of an organized criminal cult, law enforcement officials will inevitably be able to deal with it without recourse to specialist investigators. Quote, if and when members of a destructive cult commit murders, they are bound to make mistakes, leave evidence, and eventually make admissions in order to brag about their crimes or to reduce their legal liability. The discovery of the murders in Matamoros, Mexico, in April 1989, and the results of the subsequent investigation are good examples of this dynamic. Lanning's reference is revealing. Rather than supporting his analysis, Matamoros, in fact, reveals its fundamental flaw. That spring, a number of adolescent American youths were abducted, killed, stewed, and eaten before police got onto the case. By relying on reactive policing, Lanning is tacitly admitting that his blueprint amounts to mopping up the blood rather than adequate crime prevention. It also flies in the face of established law enforcement practices worldwide. All major police organizations accept that specialist squads constantly gathering intelligence are vital to prevent the commission of serious offences. Drugs, terrorism, even football hooliganism are now accorded this special threat status. That child abuse or pedophilia, whatever its motivation, does not generally merit such attention is inexplicable. Only in America has there been even the most modest attempt at creating specialist national abuse teams. And yet the second plank of the conventional law enforcement approach to ritual abuse is based, particularly in Britain, on the assumption that such expertise does exist and that this alone will be enough to police the limited instance of satanic abuse. The reality is depressingly different. The structure of British law enforcement actively works against the successful prosecution of most child abuse offences. British police forces are almost entirely regionally organised, funded and operated. With rare exceptions, drugs and terrorism being the two most notable examples, even neighbouring forces do not cooperate on the day-to-day problems of policing, much less on issues of wider public policy. What that means is that isolated pools of experience build up, but remain cut off from the vast majority of detectives and uniformed officers. In the 8 years since Chief Superintendent David Cole successfully prosecuted Britain's first case of ritual abuse, he has not been invited to address one conference on the issue of satanic crime. Quote, unless you actually stumble across one of these offences, as I did, then you, as an ordinary copper, never get to find out about them. That can be a fairly rare experience, and it's quite likely that many policemen don't know what to look for when confronted with a crime which is possibly satanically motivated. When I was working in the Newell homicide case, not only did it receive a lot of publicity nationally, but all forces were circulated with the details. I asked in that circular for any officer with any similar experience to contact me. I had very little response. And then the reference from above. This is less surprising than its source might suggest. Respected American child welfare charities such as Defense for Children International have repeatedly attacked Lanning's child abuse theories as dangerously cautious. Of course, the possibility exists that the reason why Chief Superintendent Cole received such a small response is that very little satanic or ritual crime exists. That, as we shall see shortly, has been the subject of a heated debate inside the American law enforcement community. As with any crime, however, statistics are only as good as the skills of those who investigate and record it. As Cole, by no means a satanic fanatic, was to admit, it is at the very least, quote, a possibility that detectives untrained in the nature of ritual crime fail to recognize it when they investigate, quote, bizarre incidents. Perhaps the best analogy stems from the David, son of Sam Berkowitz case in America. To law enforcement officers in New York, California, and the Midwest, the piles of dead and mutilated dogs discovered regularly between 1969 and 1978 were no more than that, mounds of unpleasant animal carcasses. But what Berkowitz knew, and subsequently explained to Maury Terry, was that those dead dogs were, in some cases at least, the trademark of a satanic cult, and one which was ultimately responsible for a number of human killings. The first relevant paper survey of police records throughout Britain suggests that ritual abuse occurs in 1 in every 40 cases of child sex rings. Organised networks distinguished from other cases because they involve either multiple perpetrators or multiple victims. The study was carried out in October 1990 on behalf of a BBC documentary examining the incidence of organised child sexual abuse. It involved 186 proven cases of such networked molestation and appeared to show only 5 in which there were claims of ritual or satanic abuse. The problem with the survey, even though it showed for the first time a discernible level of satanic abuse cases on police files, was twofold. Firstly, and as we've seen, there's considerable doubt that detectives or uniformed officers in Britain would invariably recognise or record such satanic claims. Natalie's case, had it reached a successful prosecution, would not have been entered on the ritual abuse statistics. The second flaw was in the basis of the survey itself. Such was the attitude of British police forces that only 2/3 of the 52 individual forces throughout Britain bothered to reply. Nor is there any nationwide unit for this vital intelligence work. Britain's only police squad maintaining any form of intelligence on any form of organised paedophilia, ritual or not, is the Obscene Publications branch of the Metropolitan Police. Its operational head, Superintendent Mike Hames, is attempting to have logged on a localised computer database all the intelligence information that his men receive. A frank, open and genuinely committed man, Hames readily admits that the organised child sex rings are far more common than current statistics reveal. Hames should know his men have a 20-year backlog of casework, growing by the day, and with no prospect of compiling a reliable and nationally accessible database of their information for several years. But Hames also knows that his teams work almost exclusively in London. Outside the capital, there's no similar work undertaken. Ironically, the mechanisms and logistics exist to research and log such findings. Although Britain does not have an equivalent of the FBI's behavioural science unit, one internal law enforcement organisation does attempt to keep abreast of trends within policing policy. The Association of Chief Police Officers of England, Wales and Northern Ireland, ACPO, was formed in 1948 and mounts conferences, seminars and training workshops throughout the UK. It has nearly 300 individual members, all very senior serving officers. APCO has begun to build a body of research into the issue of satanic ritual crime, but it has found stumbling blocks even within its own membership. In the summer of 1989, one of ACPO researchers complained, "I've been trying to get data out of a number of forces, but I keep getting the knockback. It's not that they haven't heard of the problem, or in some cases that they haven't got it. It's just that they don't want to tell anyone." I would, again, point people to Freemasonry, and particularly in the police force. Almost a year later, this attitude was reflected and confirmed by a senior London detective in one of the Metropolitan Police's 8 AMIPs, Area Major Investigation Pools, which handle all potentially troublesome cases of murder and rape. Quote, sure, we've got ritual abuse cases on our files. We've got ritual murders there too, but we won't say that publicly. This subject's not for discussion. End of story. For whatever reason, and there's no clearly definable motive, many police forces throughout Britain are extremely reluctant to accept evidence of ritual crime. One result of this has been an isolation of therapists handling such cases. Since the Butler-Sloss report, much emphasis has been placed on the maintenance of good relations between social services department child safety workers and their opposite numbers in the local police force. This has on occasions become a shibboleth, a sacred cow preserved at the expense of damaging children. According to Pam Hudson, local authority therapists she met on a British lecture tour in 1988 were simply unable to progress existing cases of ritual abuse through the multidisciplinary machinery. Quote, at each meeting I did, social workers came up afterwards and said, hey, I've had a case of ritual abuse, but I couldn't do anything with it. These weren't people suddenly thinking that ritual abuse might fit a particular case after hearing my lecture. They were trained workers with existing caseloads. Now, okay, there weren't dozens of them saying this, and this was only a small sample, but I think Great Britain has a problem, and it needs to wake up to it. In part, the problem that law enforcement has with ritual abuse cases is that the vast majority of testimony comes from very young children. Although the 1988 Criminal Justice Act formally abolished the convention that children's testimony had to be corroborated by other evidence in court, many judges and local CPS officers still regard it as suspect and refuse to rely on it alone. Children are still deemed to be unable to distinguish fantasy from reality. But how valid is that view? Children are certainly suggestible. That is, ideas can be imprinted on their minds as reality when they are in fact fictional. A service by the Broadcasting Standards Council in October 1990 showed that a sample survey of 6 to 9-year-olds in Leeds, drawn from a wide and representative socio-economic background, failed to distinguish between reality and fantasy in TV soap operas. More disturbingly, they also exhibited frequently low comprehension of what they saw on screen and failed to differentiate accurately between goodies and baddies. But the BSC survey only covered images presented to the children on a television screen, not events which they had actually experienced at first hand. Academic and clinical studies show that the children have highly accurate recall of events in which they have been involved. When these events are traumatic, the recalling of them frequently causes the children extreme distress. The way in which a child discloses abuse can be as important in determining the veracity of the story as the words spoken. Put simply, the worse the experience being described, the more visibly painful will be its disclosure. I just make a note as a survivor myself, and with regard to some cases, some children will disclose in a dispassionate manner, and that is not to be confused with undermining the veracity. It just means that they have been so profoundly tortured and traumatized consistently that they have split, so they can make the disclosures in a dissociative state. Dissociative identity disorder. So if it's not a blanket understanding, you can have people disclose in dissociative state, and it sounds like they're very dispassionate. We saw in Chapter 1 that the British Psychological Society now accepts that children's evidence in sexual abuse cases tends to be reliable rather than inaccurate. In September 1990, an independent study by 2 academic psychologists supported that conclusion. Dr. Jim Baxter of Strathclyde University and Professor Graham Davies of Leicester University studied the recall powers of two groups of children. Each group comprised 20 boys and girls. The first was made up of 7-year-olds, the second of 11-year-olds. The children were asked to watch a mocked-up theft from a car and then to sit down and construct a fantasy story based loosely on what they'd witnessed. 4 days later, the psychologist asked them to remember in details of the incident itself, separating them from the fantasies they'd woven around it. The results showed that although some small elements of fantasy remained in the final versions, every child recalled accurately the salient point of the theft itself. To Dr. Baxter, the implication for the legal presumption that children's imagination makes their evidence of sexual abuse or any other crime suspect was clear. Quote, "No one has looked to see if that is true. I'm not saying that 7-year-old children are as reliable as adults, but they should not automatically be regarded as unreliable. It should be left to the common sense of a jury." So much for the academic view. What then are the ground rules under which children's testimony of sexual or ritual abuse are considered by police and therapists? Until the publication of the Butler-Sloss report in 1988, both, in theory, worked to a set of guidelines issued in 1986 by the Department of Health. Quote, "A child's statement that he or she is being abused should be accepted as true until proved otherwise. Children seldom lie about sexual abuse." The controversy surrounding Cleveland's, quote, "discovery of widespread child sexual abuse made a revision of that principle a political inevitability. After Butler-Sloss, the Department of Health guidelines stated merely that a child's disclosure of sexual abuse should always be taken seriously. The reason for this dilution was a public perception that pediatricians and social workers in Cleveland had been too quick to accept not only a child's statement that he or she was being abused, but that the abuser was a parent. The fact that this perception, fanned by irresponsible and breathtakingly inaccurate press reporting, was a complete fantasy meant nothing. The belief was abroad that social workers operated a strict and simplistic policy of always believe the child. Professor John Newson, director of the Child Development Centre at Nottingham University, summed up this newly sceptical view in the summer of 1990. Quote, "You've got to listen very carefully and treat seriously anything the child says, but there are still professionals who think everything a child says should be believed, and that's a very dangerous point of view. You've got to treat it with the greatest possible caution. There are at least some children who are completely unreliable witnesses and will say anything. Others are persuaded to tell a story to indict someone for adult reasons, for example in divorce cases." On what did Professor Newsom base this radically opposing view of children's reliability in sexual abuse cases? In part, he was quoting American research which appears to show that substantially more false allegations are made in divorce and child custody cases, but not child abuse cases, than in any other type of litigation. But his most recent research, and certainly his formative personal experience, was as a consultant to an inquiry team investigating the handling of the Nottingham ritual abuse case. As we shall see in Chapter 7, that inquiry, and indeed Professor Newson's role in it, was less than scientific in its approach. Before we examine the Nottingham case, however, we need to place the British experience in some form of international context. If police in the United Kingdom are sceptical or obstructive, and social workers isolated and under attack. How have other nation states coped with the reporting of satanic ritual abuse? Children's evidence, Holland. Holland has, for more than 25 years, adopted a distinctly ambivalent approach to all aspects of child abuse. The Dutch government was among the first to allow commercial trading in child pornography and amongst the last to outlaw it. At the same time, its social services and welfare policies have been largely supportive of children's legitimate demands for human rights. This relaxed and liberal approach has led to a devalued perception of the damage caused by child sexual abuse. The ultimate and in some ways logical end result was the effective abandoning in 1990 of sexual consent laws once children passed the age of 12. Although carried through the Dutch Parliament for the best and most practical of motives, it is not without justification that the liberalising statute has been dubbed a paedophile's charter. The response of both the Justice Department in The Hague and police forces in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, whenever foreign politicians or journalists have questioned Holland's policy on child sexual abuse, has been invariably one of unrestrained antagonism. Against this background, it was not perhaps surprising that the Oude Pekela ritual abuse disclosures received distinctly short shrift. According to Dr. Fred Jonkers, quote, the attitude of certain Dutch officials in public and without having taken the time to speak with the children, the parents, or the experts, was denial and rejection, dismissal of the children's stories because of their bizarre nature. Yet we knew that the phenomenon of ritual abuse was not a rarity. One of Finkelhor's studies showed that there were signs of ritual abuse in 13% of the cases involving sexually abused children in daycare centers in the United States. Furthermore, there are undeniable similarities between a number of noted cases in Oude Pekela in May 1987 and various cases in America. But when we suggested the possibility of satanic rituals being involved here, even the concerned public prosecutor replied, just because it happens in the States doesn't mean that it happens here. From the outset, the official reaction to the Oude Pekela disclosures were loftily dismissive. Although a major police investigation was launched immediately after Jonkers reported his suspicion of a possible sex ring, it lacked both political support and expert advice. Quote, not all the children were medically examined, for example. The Justice Department didn't retain a child psychiatrist until 6 weeks after the police had begun their inquiry. And even this was partly due to pressure from the media. This initial attitude of the judicial authorities also led to reports in the press suggesting mass hysteria. Often, judicial officials were cited as the source of the reports. The result was that the major discussion was about the phenomenon of mass hysteria and not on the issue of child sexual abuse. Yes, the Oude Pekela affair received much attention. Outrage was there, but also direct denial in the press. Parents were made out to be subject to this mass hysteria and to be fanatic porno hunters who only wanted to stir up the whole matter. It became a struggle against disbelief, both for the involved physicians and for the criminal investigation team versus the public prosecutor. The final outcome was that while on the one hand there were many parents, social workers, police officers, and members of the general public who believed the children's stories, there were on the other hand a large number of people who ascribed the stories to the children's fantasies. It is worth reminding ourselves of some of the key details of these fantasies. Quote, the Oude Pekela children, largely independently, described being abused by a large number of adults who chanted in a strange language. Sometimes the adults dressed up as clowns, other times as lions and bears. The children claimed that these mysterious adults walked around the children in a circular dance, tied them up, or locked them in cages. They forced the children to eat feces and drink urine or blood. Drugs were administered and babies mutilated or killed. Cameras had captured much of this on film or video. If the public prosecutor was skeptical about the links with overseas cases of ritual abuse, the remarkable similarity between the details disclosed by children in the Dutch village and in a number of US preschool cases was later to disturb leading American authority on sexual abuse, Dr. Roland Summit. Speaking on Dutch television 2 years after the Ude Pekler case was dropped, the psychiatrist said, quote, "I am astounded that the case in Holland is identical to cases we have in this country. And by identical, I mean the otherwise bizarre things that the children describe, which we would all like to hope could not happen to children anywhere, have been described in detail by children in Holland and by children in 50 to 60 other cases throughout the United States. For example, I was amazed to hear that Ude Pekler children described costuming with the same kind of specificity as occurred here in America. Children in our cases described being involved with jungle animals as if they were riding on elephants, lions, and tigers. They described grown-ups being dressed in costumes of clowns. Very often described numbers of black hooded people dressed in robes and involved in circular movements and chants. Neither Summit nor Yonkers could find a rational way of explaining this synchronization of disclosures from children at least 3,000 miles apart. Yonkers readily admitted the possibility of small-scale contamination of evidence within the Dutch village itself, though even this was not extensive enough to damage the independence of the testimony. But there was no possibility that American child survivors could have imposed their experience on children they did not know existed. Nor could the explanations have been contaminated by adult professionals, police, or social workers exposed to the germ of ritual abuse information. One of the problems Yonkers faced, particularly in the early stages of the Satanic disclosures, was that neither he nor any of his colleagues had heard about ritual abuse, much less absorbed the precise detail of its key indicators. One factor in this dismissal of the children's stories in Ude Pekler was the lack of unequivocal medical evidence of abuse. It puzzled Yonkers too, and after 6 weeks of relatively fruitless official investigation, he conducted his own clinical study of reported symptoms among the 90 children. Quote, "The supporters of the, quote, children's fantasy theory had eagerly used the outcome of the limited official medical tests as proof that nothing had actually happened to the children. To acquire a more objective view, my wife and I decided to conduct a survey, which ultimately involved the parents of 90 children. The survey was held from the end of June 1987, and in the course of this period, a number of behavioral changes became apparent, both to parents and acquaintances. It should be made clear that the data gathered by my wife and myself does not claim to have absolute scientific values. It reflects the indicated tendencies rather than significant statistical data. The Yonkers collected information from the children's parents about physical indications consistent with abuse and behavioral symptoms. Although they'd never heard of Pamela Hudson, their limited study is similar to her pioneering work in California. Of the 90 children covered by the survey, in 17 cases, the parents could afterwards recall no physical signs indicative indicative of abuse. For the rest, there was a visible pattern. 34 children had apparently displayed an unusual degree of bruising in abnormal places. 22 had inflamed genitalia. 21 experienced pain when urinating, and 18 found it extremely painful to defecate. The parents of 16 children had noticed inexplicable stains in their youngsters' underwear. 12 children had had inflamed anal areas. The psychological indicators were similarly revealing, with unusually high numbers of children reported as showing overdeveloped sexual behavior for their age, inappropriate feelings of shame about their genitals, sudden bedwetting, nightmares disturbing previously normal sleep patterns, and inexplicable aggression or nervousness. The Yonkers were careful to note that such was the nature of the survey that alternate explanation could be found for all the physical and behavioral symptoms. This is in fact not unusual in cases of sexual abuse. Some anal scarring, for example, could be either evidence of sexual abuse or merely the result of severe constipation. Similarly, the doctors recognized that their study was potentially flawed by the fact it asked parents to recall such symptoms after they'd become aware of the possibility of sexual and/or ritual abuse in Uday Pakula. But the sheer weight of correlation between American key indicators of satanic abuse in America and the wholly separate results of the Yonkers study raised once again the unanswerable question: how could two such communities independently arrive at the same conclusions? The formal verdict on the Uday Pakula affair was that it had been a case of mass hysteria. No arrests were even made, no charges ever brought. Yet privately, the police admitted they were certain that at least 32 children had been abused, and that a further 25 were likely to have been victims. In only 2 cases did the detectives rule out abuse altogether. And of course, no admissions were ever made as to whether the abuse had taken place during rituals, as the children alleged, or simply as part of an organized ring of pedophiles. Fred Yonkers and his wife, both physicians to the small village community, have no such doubts. Quote, "In our opinion, sexual abuse of children took place on a large scale in Uday Pakula. This abuse was not limited to physical contact. A number of children were victims of ritual abuse. Our conviction is based upon the spontaneity with which the stories were told by the children and on the behavioral techniques we used. We took into account the nature of the data we acquired from potentially unstable or suggestible parents and the possibility of fake stories. Moreover, the specialist child psychiatrist sent to Uday Pakula by the Junior Justice Department came here first as a disbeliever. But after conducting his investigation under the most strict requirements, he only confirmed our convictions. Why, given the weight of evidence, be it in Holland, Britain, or elsewhere, are children's matching disclosures of ritual abuse so abruptly dismissed? The American psychiatrist and child abuse specialist, Dr. Roland Summit, studied a number of ritual cases and came to a disturbing conclusion. Quote, there are a couple of issues in these ritual abuse cases that divide people and lead them to fight against belief. One is the description of pornography. The children described being photographed in sexual and humiliating kinds of situations. People investigating expect then to find the pictures so that they will have the proof. When the pictures aren't found, and somehow routinely the pictures are hidden or lost, people are likely to discredit everything else the children say because of their disappointment and anger at being led to expect physical evidence that isn't there. The second argument is even stronger. When the children describe being involved in murder, then people demand that there be missing people, and they demand that there be bodies. When there is no direct corroboration of either of those, the children are punished. The children are blamed for lying when the proof doesn't emerge. My advice to those of you in Europe who have the opportunity to look at these cases for the first time is to try and profit from our mistakes in the United States. These are not generally cases which will be satisfactory to criminal tests of guilt. The first goal should not be to figure out who you're going to put in jail or who's going to be arrested for these crimes. People will fight over that and destroy any understanding of what might be happening to the children. The nature of this phenomenon seems to be that the people who are doing it are much too smart, much too well hidden, and much too aware of crowd process to risk being caught. They will take public concern and skepticism and turn it against the children and against those people who are trying to define the problem. So the public itself becomes the enemy of discovery. Summit, of course, is a child therapist and not a detective. Yet the painful lessons he and his colleagues have learned over more than 6 years of ritual abuse cases gave him the experience to recommend the safest path through the emerging European cases. Quote, I would suggest that someone take charge of finding out what happened to children and learning why. Only then, after validating that such things really do happen, and that there are people who have the knowledge and power to brainwash children into silence, only then can people use that intelligence to figure out how this can be stopped and who can be held responsible for it. It is a lesson European law enforcement and much of the therapeutic community has yet to learn. Nor is that particularly surprising. In the reporting of ritual abuse, America led Europe and was led in its turn by Canada. As skeptics have been so keen to point out, most contemporary reporting of satanic crimes began when Michelle Smith met Dr. Lawrence Pastor in British Columbia in 1976. How then has Canada coped? By the time Lawrence Pastor finished coaxing the details of satanic ritual abuse from Michelle Smith's buried memories, the events themselves were almost 25 years distant. There was no remote possibility of any effective law enforcement response. To compensate for this, the psychiatrist and his patient fought for, and eventually won, the acceptance of their evidence by the Vatican. Armed with this religious endorsement, Pastor set out to help educate police and therapists with a series of seminars and lectures throughout North America. It was to be 6 years before Canadian law enforcement had its chance to act on new allegations of satanic ritual abuse. The outcome, however, was unchanged. Erica and Jenny, the two sisters who told therapists in Hamilton, Ontario, of ritual abuse at the hands of their father, mother, and mother's boyfriend, exemplified between 1985 and 1987 the apparent impossibility of obtaining a successful outcome to such cases. In Canada, as in Britain, the emphasis in all abuse work was on a joint approach between the caregiving social workers and the investigative police teams. In the state of Ontario, The principal official child welfare agency is the Children's Aid Society. Its role, defined by statute law, is to determine a child's need for protection based upon its own investigation. The standard of proof required for CAS to take action, removing children from parental custody or limiting any access, is the civil law test of the balance of probabilities. So in any hearing resulting from its actions, CAS is required to prove that a child's injuries, condition, or evidence of neglect was probably caused by the direct action or negligence of the adult who legally had custody and control at the time. The police, again, as in the United Kingdom, work to a different set of rules. Their mandate is to investigate and determine whether criminal charges of abuse can be laid under the Criminal Code of Canada, the admirably organised federal statute book. The standards of proof required is much higher than that in civil cases. Police have to demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that the allegations against an individual are true. Although the theory says that both CAS and the police work together, there is no statutory duty on the police to investigate allegations of abuse made under or falling within the civil rights protection legislation. It was a loophole that in 1985, CAS was to discover the hard way. Erica and Jenny were aged 7 and 4 respectively when they were placed, with their mother's blessing, in the care of a respected and experienced foster mother by CAS. Shortly after they arrived, the girls told their foster mother that they had been sexually and physically abused, that they had been forced to participate in pornographic films, that they had witnessed and indeed been part of ritual killings, acts of bestiality, and cannibalism. According to Nancy McGillivray and Nora Dugan, CAS's supervisor and director of services at the time, the foster mother and social workers immediately set in train the established child abuse procedure. Quote, following the beginnings of the children's disclosures to the foster mother, the police were notified by the society and a joint child abuse investigation initiated. This included recorded interviews of the children by a child abuse specialist and the alleged perpetrators by the police, as well as the medical examination of the children. It quickly expanded to include in-depth psychiatric assessment of the children and their past and current caregivers, and a validation study of the children's statements by a team of child abuse experts. The medical tests proved relatively helpful to the children. Both Erica and Jenny had disclosed abuse of their vaginas and anuses by bananas, birds, feathers, and human flesh, all wielded by their mother and the two men. The CAS pediatrician confirmed that the limited degree of physical marks on the children's genitals was consistent with this type of abuse. Initially, the police were supportive. The detectives concerned gave every appearance of believing the two young girls, accepted insofar as they related to pornography and ritual abuse. Both of these topics were quickly placed off limits. From there on, the case, and with it Erica and Jenny, was doomed. According to Nancy McGillivray and Nora Dugan, quote, although the police, jointly with the CAS investigators, validated the sexual abuse of the children in the early stages, as the disclosures became more horrific with the allegations of ritual abuse, the veracity of the sexual abuse allegations became an issue. The overriding police premise was that the lack of proof for the former discredited the latter. This was also the main premise for the defense of the parents in the subsequent custody battle, and the investigating officers were used as defense witnesses. The general disbelief of the police was compounded by their insensitivity and lack of understanding of the process of disclosure by children and the effect on them. Safety and trust are crucial components to the disclosing process. Child victims will only disclose initially to adults they trust. The police officers were perceived by the children in this case as not believing them, and therefore not to be trusted. Consequently, the attitude of the police impeded them from getting any direct statements from the children during the investigation. This was to be further exaggerated for the children in the open display of distrust and acrimony between the police and the CAS investigators. On an outing in search of graveyards described by the children in their disclosures of ritual abuse, the police secretly recorded all conversations between the social worker, the children, and themselves. This tape demonstrates clearly the officer's predisposition to disbelief, insensitivity to the children, and hostility to the social worker. Although the children were tenacious on that day, standing up to the hostile questions of the police, finally exhausted, they recanted. As we shall see in the next chapter, the pattern of events in Hamilton, Ontario during 1985 was to be repeated almost step for step in Nottingham, England 2 years later. In McGillivray and Dugan's view, quote, the police inability to secure either direct statements from the children or physical evidence of ritual abuse drew the police to the conclusion that sexual abuse had likely not occurred, that the allegations of ritual abuse and pornography were not to be believed, and that they were in a large part the result of a gullible and manipulative social worker. Consequently, the entire criminal investigation took on a bias of disbelief, with the police trying to negate both the known and future allegations of the children. This breakdown had far-reaching effects, as illustrated by their refusal formally to respond when the foster parents reported a life-threatening plot against them, which had been relayed by the children. To be fair to the detectives, Canadian law played a significant part in their initial decision that there was not sufficient evidence for a successful criminal prosecution. At that time, though Statute C-15 subsequently modified the presumption, hearsay evidence was not admissible in abuse cases, and child victims were required to take the stand, testify under oath, and be cross-examined if there was no other corroborative evidence. The hearsay evidence, as in so many cases throughout the world, comprised the children's disclosures to their foster mother. With this excluded, and with the court-appointed psychologist refusing to allow the children to give evidence for fear of further trauma, criminal proceedings stood no chance of success. Nonetheless, nothing excuses the complete disintegration of the relationship between Kaz and the police, nor the vicious polarization of their respective attitudes. So bad did the breakdown become that there was no sharing of information between the two investigative teams, and the police either refused to supply or attempted to block access to vital information that they had gleaned, including that relating to a curious fire at a television studio which destroyed all its records. The children had alleged that they had been abused and filmed there. In the final custody case, Kaz's lawyer was forced into the absurd position of being forced to have the investigating detectives listed as hostile witnesses. It was the only way he could get information out of them under cross-examination. Kaz also began, but later withdrew, contempt of court action against its police partners in the joint investigation. Although the case of Erica and Jenny can now be seen in some lights as a victory for the common sense approach to ritual abuse, Judge Thomas Beckett, deciding that the allegations of ritual mattered primarily because the children believed them to be true, it also shows how the judicial process in such cases fails every individual involved. Erica and Jenny had asked to be allowed to go home when all the nastiness was sorted out. This was rendered impossible. The girl's mother, who it emerged during the hearings had been severely sexually and ritually abused as a child herself, never obtained the therapy she needed so badly. Neither did her husband or boyfriend. The foster mother was put under immense strain and constantly attacked by lawyers for the parents. Because of a discovery of a plot to kill her, Erica and Jenny were taken away from her home and placed in a more secure location. They lost the first adult they had learned to trust, and she lost the reason she'd been caught up in the case in the first place. The working relationship between the therapists and the police was holed below the waterline. Neither could go forward to handle future joint cases in any confidence. It would take several years to repair the damage. Although Judge Beckett praised and supported the CAS evidence and techniques within a year of the case ending, every one of the social work investigators left child welfare for less stressful employment. Behind this catalogue of misery and missed opportunities lay one thing: a refusal to contemplate the reality of ritual abuse. That refusal has underpinned policing not merely in Canada, but throughout the Western world. Even in the one country to take child abuse seriously as an international problem, America, Children's Evidence in the United States. Friday the 23rd of June 1989, 11th Annual Virginia Crime Prevention Conference, Chesapeake, Virginia. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm quoting, "My name is Robert Hicks and I'm a criminal justice analyst with the Law Enforcement Section of the Department of Criminal Justice Services, Richmond, Virginia. I wish to alert you to a dangerous cult that has implanted itself not only in Virginia, but throughout the country. This group, called the Chenevnok cult, is a, quote, communal sectarian group affiliated with a large and powerful international religious organization. I can communicate something to you of the methods and goals of the organization by describing the cult's recruitment and indoctrination practices. The cult claims or aims to recruit young women, either teenagers or young adults, and does so openly at schools and colleges. Following indoctrination into the cult, young women eventually lose any power of will, succumbing entirely to the regimen of the cult. Cult members must abandon their formal lives, even surrendering their outside friendships and personal possessions. Cult members' activities then involve the cult exclusively. Members must rise at 4:30 in the morning, wear prayer beads attached to their wrists, engage in long, monotonous chants and prayers, and in one of the most bizarre activities, members consumed food they were told represented the dead body, the dead cult founder's body. Women must even pledge in writing absolute obedience to the cult. To further distance itself from worldly affairs, the cult assigns new names to members and designates as their birthdays the dates of their entry into the cult. I get where this is going. After hours of performing menial tasks such as scrubbing floors, coupled with the incessant recitation of ritualistic prayers, members might occasionally transgress rules which are punished harshly. For example, punishment might require women to go without food, having to beg on the knees for crumbs from others' plates. But the most shocking ritual of all required members to become brides to the dead cult leader. I hope that I have sufficiently aroused your curiosity, if not your indignation and anger, that such activities could happen in the United States, in case you haven't figured it out. Chnevnok is convent spelt backwards. I have just described the socialization of young women into Christian convents. A clever and memorable trick to enhance understanding or an indication of a more sinister trend within US law enforcement's analysis of satanic ritual abuse. Hicks would certainly lay claim to the former and condemn the latter view as evidence of the paranoia he believes has derailed much of his colleagues' methodology. Either way, and it's perhaps curious that Hicks licensed America's Wiccan Church as the distributor of his speech. The paper he presented that Friday in June 1989 marked the logical end of a decade in which American detectives had first led the way to understanding ritual abuse and then squandered their lead through internal squabbling and shoddy analysis. When the United States awoke to the issue of satanic ritual crime in the early 1980s, it had already undergone a thorough and public scrutiny of its research and responses on the issues of pedophilia and child pornography. A series of state and congressional hearings from 1977 onward had yielded dramatic testimony about the nature and extent of the twin problems and disturbing evidence of the country's inability to handle them. The result of these hearings was a new emphasis, from the White House downward, which placed a higher priority on policing child abuse at home and abroad. Although individual police departments periodically recorded cases of bizarre and apparently occult-related offences, from homicide to indecency, national attention was only drawn to the problem of ritual abuse after a series of child sex scandals in daycare or preschool centres across the country. The first such case centered around the McMartin preschool in Manhattan Beach, California. We shall examine the McMartin affair, America's longest, costliest, and least successful criminal prosecution ever, when we analyze the world's two most important ritual abuse cases in detail in the next chapter. But McMartin was followed by an apparent epidemic of similar cases, each engendering ever greater controversy which only increased as the allegations grew from the ordinary, quote, child molestation to claims of ritual abuse, torture, and murder. The cases had at first been handled with a degree of self-confidence. America had looked into itself and discovered the awful reality of child sexual abuse. Now it knew the problem and how to solve it. But with the first hints of Satanism came polarization, acrimony, and a culture of disbelief. The nation that had done so much to police child sexual crimes across the globe began to tear itself apart over a familiar question: can we believe the children? Quote, for a fuller account, no, it's not a quote, it's a reference. For a fuller account of US policy and practice, see Child Pornography, an Investigation, published by Methuen in 1990, by the same author. Policing Satanism in America. Between 1985 and 1990, juries convicted 15 adults for sexual abuse in cases where the victims alleged that rituals took place. But in only 3 of the 9 cases was evidence of the rituals introduced. In the remainder, it was filtered out by either federal or local prosecuting attorneys. The first was the Miami Country Walk babysitting service case in 1985. As we saw in Chapter 2, although never specifically prosecuted as ritual abuse, not only did the victim's testimony match most of the key indicators as defined by Pam Hudson, but one of the perpetrators, Ileana Fuster, pleaded guilty halfway through the trial. It is worth listing the details contained in the statements of more than a dozen children which Fuster agreed to be accurate. Her husband Frank had regularly ordered her to undress in front of the children and to perform oral sex on them. Sometimes both wore white robes and green masks to carry out the abuse. Their victims had been made to drink a liquid combination of urine, tranquilizers, and pop. Frank Fuster had also made the children watch him rape his wife with a crucifix, and then killed a number of blue parakeets to frighten them into silence. Videotapes had indeed, as the children alleged, been made of the rituals. That none were found, according to Ileana, was the work of one of her husband's accomplices. He had removed them the night before Frank Fuster was arrested. Not only did the Country Walk case provide the first recorded case of multiple ritual abuse in the United States, it also managed to highlight the flaws in law enforcement's approach to such reports. Initial response to the children's allegations about Ileana and Frank Fuster was left in the hands of a caseworker, a generic and frequently inexperienced level of social worker, rather than being immediately adopted by local police. The caseworker in question had never investigated a case of what she quaintly called, quote, sexual harassment before. During the trial, it emerged that her method of inquiry was to arrive at the Fuster's Centre, unannounced, knock on the door, and ask Ileana if she had been sexually harassing any children. The trial transcript continues. I'm going to take a break here. I'm almost at the end of this chapter, but as you might have seen there, I've run out of the manuscript. It must be in a separate PDF, so I will attach the end of this chapter in a second, very brief audio reading. Clearly, a lot of this book is relevant to police, therapists, judges, and solicitors for understanding, prosecuting, and counselling purposes, and hopefully some small comfort to mothers and victims that have not had the help they required or have not had the courage to disclose. What a mess. And just with this being 2020, so this book is almost 20 years ago. Next year it'll be 20 years ago it was published. I would assert that there's indication that one motivation for not facing up to the existence of ritual abuse and satanic crime is because many people enjoy child pornography, and many more than we suspected are involved in satanic covens, and many are in a satanic connected coven at the upper levels, which is, as we saw in previous chapters, Freemasonry. So even a video I just made separately about a madam in London called Madam Sin, Cynthia Payne, talks about how many judges, solicitors, barristers, vicars, and politicians were the clientele. So I would suggest that there's more reason than just clumsiness or ignorance. I don't mean to hammer the point. But anyway, forgive me, I'm going to end this chapter early and just look for the next brief video which will complete it properly. Thanks for listening. Angela Power Disney.